Well, as always, thank you to the awesome team from CyberX and the Cyber Exchange cohort for making another Power Hour session happen. The last Power Hour session of the summer. Believe it or not, the summer is almost done and we are preparing for fall, where we have a number of new Power Hours coming up in relation to CISO Forum, as well as one more very exciting event. So thank you to Maddie and their team for making this session happen. All of you know that before I go deeper into introducing myself, that I do a lot of work with students, not just students at the undergrad level, but also at the graduate level. And the term analyst often comes up, whether I'm teaching in AI, whether I'm teaching in security, or whether I'm teaching in business in general. One of the things that I always tell my students is that analysis can tell you what to do, but it cannot make you act on it. There's a little bit of a bridge that you need to cross there. And in today's session, I'm going to get you to meet with an individual who helps you understand not only how to do the analysis, but how to act on it. My mom always says that the value of life is in the connections that you make. And I'm very glad to have met this individual back at the Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Conference. I've often said that the power of showing up is 99% of the battle when you're trying to build your reputation in the cybersecurity community. And this is one individual who saw me speak at Canadian Women in Cyber and took those 5 seconds to send me a note to thank me. Since then, we've built a friendship, we've built a relationship, and today is my first Power Hour with this individual. So without further ado, all of you know me very well. My name is Ali Hirji. I work at Durham College in the beautiful city of Oshawa, leading both AI and cybersecurity. And my guest today is an individual who, if you're with the ISC squared community, is in need of no introduction. Josh, who works as a Senior Threat Intelligence Analyst at one of Canada's big 5 banks from the city of Toronto. Josh, welcome to the Power Hour. It is a pleasure to have you, my man.
Thank you so much. It is a genuine pleasure to be here. And it's funny reflecting on that first interaction we had. I wouldn't have guessed at that moment that it would lead to me being featured in one of your Power Hours, but it makes me so glad that I reached out and actually took the time to start up the conversation with you. So happy to be here.
Pleasure's all mine. We've got about 52 people that are online, and to our audience, please feel free to drop your questions in the live chat. If you're feeling a little shy and you just want to direct message your questions to me, you can always do that as well. Now, before we begin, I always find it important that while we've acknowledged the fact that I'm coming in from Oshawa, Josh is coming in from the city of Toronto, it's also important to recognize that we are coming across to you virtually. The virtual space is also Indigenous space. And as you know, and as I've said before, our fiber cables, our ground cables, our aerial connections as well, all run across Indigenous land and Indigenous air. So it's important for us to recognition to that and acknowledge the Indigenous cultures and the Indigenous rights of the communities that we operate in, and we continue to practice cybersecurity within. Let's jump into this discussion. And for those of you who are watching, for some of you who are advanced in your career, this might give you an opportunity to reflect. For those of you who are at that midpoint where you want to get to that executive-like position in cybersecurity, you're probably going to find some tips and tricks here. And for those of you who are just starting and sometimes have this aversion to the word analyst or analysis, here's an opportunity for you to ask some questions, but also learn from somebody who's been there, done that, and is continuously growing. I've said this before, success is not a product, it's a process. Let's study this process with Josh. Now, Josh, unless LinkedIn is not being true to me, your academic career did not necessarily begin in the technical side of cybersecurity. Can you tell us a little bit about how you started off in your undergraduate and graduate careers? Josh?
Absolutely. This is a really interesting topic because when I was an undergrad, I made the decision to pick an undergrad, a subject or a topic based on my genuine interests. So I give myself that freedom of space just to react to what interests me, as opposed to taking an undergraduate degree that I thought I should take in terms of like employability. I knew loads of people in the undergrad who had picked degrees because either their parents wanted them to take them or because they were trying to get into a certain career path. And I decided that it was more important to study something that I'm interested in than worry about studying a degree for the like employability factor in the postgrad. And back then, the whole plan was to do an undergraduate in politics or in international relations, and then do a law conversion course. Because at that point, age 18, I was set on being a criminal lawyer. And it's funny how much plans changed.
Now, when you look at how these plans changed, you went in, and if I'm not mistaken, you began your career in the United Kingdom and then you moved on geographically as well. Did you ever think in your undergrad career that you would end up going from one country to another? And did you ever imagine at any point of time that cybersecurity would be an area of focus for you? Josh?
Absolutely not. Not at all. If you'd asked me age 18 if I'd ever work in cybersecurity, I would have laughed at you, because we have these perceptions that cybersecurity is a highly technical field. And you can only be in cybersecurity if you've got a computer science background, or if you're a highly technical person. And I internalized those perceptions for years, and like right through from age 18 when I first started studying politics up to I'd say like around age, I don't think now, around age 25,
Yeah.
24, I still held those perceptions that like I couldn't possibly pivot into cybersecurity because it is a very technical field. I don't have that background in it. But it was through having conversations with people who work in that space that I started to realize that these perceptions are just perceptions. Whilst there's some truth in them, they aren't the entire truth, and they don't tell the full story. And I realized that cybersecurity is a very, very like a far broader field than anyone ever really anticipates until you get into it. And you have the full range of teams, from the highly technical to the more strategic and analytical in nature. And it wasn't until I started talking to professionals in that space and also doing my own research into the different job paths that I realized that you can actually work in cybersecurity without the technical like IT background.
Yeah.
And that was a really interesting process. Like it broke down this barrier that I had mentally established between physical security and kind of like threat intelligence in that space, and doing threat intelligence in the cyberspace. And I feel very fortunate to have had those conversations and kind of had that revelation, because I was able to move into cyber threat intelligence, and it was fascinating space, like super interesting.
Absolutely, and I go back to something that was said at the last major CyberX conference, Cyber Exchange 3.0, where SentinelOne made reference to the fact, do not dump data, dump context. And I think with your background in politics, political economy, sociology, psychology, etc., you get a little bit of the context behind the motivations around certain attacks. A fun fact for those of you who are watching, if you've ever read any academic papers or just even media reports on Stuxnet, for example, all of you know about that attack which hit the Iranian nuclear reactors. The analysis that was provided from a political standpoint was absolutely essential in trying to identify what led to this attack, the timing of the attack, and who was involved behind it. And that context comes from an interdisciplinary perspective, which Josh brings to the table. Josh, believe it or not, because we do have quite a few students that are watching today, I've got one or two direct messages, and one or two of my students who are a little shy, and I respect that. They've WhatsApped me a question or two, and one of them being around what put the thought of cybersecurity in your head. Now, I always tell my students, a thought doesn't make you, it's what you make of it. Was there someone in your circle? Was there a professor? Was there somebody around you that said, hey, this could be a path for you? Or did you just happen to stumble upon it yourself? Josh?
I never want to give the perception that like I am an island and that I do anything like completely independently. I often advocate that your network is normally the sum of your strength in your career. And it was someone who I built a relationship with when I was a co-op, like years ago, when I was fresh in Toronto, working at another Big Five institution. The person who I built a relationship with there had a very similar academic background to me.
Interesting.
And they were like further along in their career, and they made that pivot into cyber threat intelligence. And it was, I always found that quite interesting. And it was when we started to discuss that move and how they found it, I started to realize that maybe this isn't closed off to me. Maybe I could do something similar. And eventually a spot opened up on that team, and they let me know that, hey, we're now hiring. I think you'd be a good fit. Like I know the work that you can do, even though you don't have the academic background, nor did I. You can learn on the job. And that conversation was completely illuminating. And it really did result in this huge shift in my career. So that's why I always encourage people. I know everyone advocates for networking, but what I really advocate is like having like genuine conversations and building relationships with people, because you never know like when you'll cross paths again in your future, and you'll never know the added value that they can bring to you. It can come very sporadically, but it can have a huge impact on your career and your life.
Absolutely. And I think the key there is those conversations. And
Mm-hmm.
you also have to be surrounded by people who are able to have some of those conversations about a technical field, but looking at it differently. This is one of the reasons. And I see a question about this, and I'll answer it, and we'll come a little bit to it as we move forward. Is when you're picking a degree in cybersecurity, let's say you want to specialize in cybersecurity,
Mm-hmm.
you will notice, for example, at Durham College, or whether you go to U of T, whether you go to Toronto School of Management, wherever, Willis College, wherever you go, you will notice that in your cybersecurity trainings, you will have something that has a social bent to it. You will have something that has a political bent to it. These are all meant to open up those new avenues of thought and moving away uniform thinking into more multiplicity of thought. So for our audience members, that's some good food for thought when you're looking at picking your next cybersecurity degree or program that you want to get into. Now, Josh, you finished your undergrad, you finished your master's, you started to network, you got into the field. You also then dedicated yourself to getting a couple of certifications.
Mm-hmm.
Is it fair for us to ask, how did you go about choosing which was the right certification for you? And once you even chose, I believe you have the CISSP, for example, how did you go about training for this and continuing to build your knowledge base? Josh?
Yeah, that was a painful experience. Doing the CISSP was like months of like evenings and weekends, and it was hell. To be completely honest with you, it was a lot of self-study alongside one career, and I picked doing it during the COVID winter, because that was a period in which the distractions were lessened. And like, I don't mean to put anyone off certifications, that they are super useful. They're a really good learning experience. And again, it kind of like, it flags you as someone who's serious about cybersecurity and who knows X, Y, and Z. And when you pick something like the TISSP, it's got that kind of wide recognition. So it can really be like a good like force multiplier in your career. But what I did, what I kind of like made the mistake of doing, is I did 2 certifications pretty much back to back. I think I took a month off in between them. So I wanted to get as much done during the COVID winter as possible. So 7 months, it was like 1 certification, studies, like the bulk of it, 1 month off. And then I think it was 2.5 months for the second one. I wouldn't recommend anyone does this. Like it's a lot of work and put under a lot of stress. But my approach, I'll talk about first how I picked the CISSP, and then I'll talk about like how I kind of like my strategies for how to attack it. So I did a lot of research, first of all, into like where I want to take my career and like what the next step is, because I think certifications should be used strategically. They should like help unlock the next step. And I'm someone who's really keen on moving up into management and leadership. I think my skill sets are stronger in the like in the soft skills, social management side of things, in comparison to the technical side. Like I've been working on increasing my technical skill sets for the past few years, but I definitely am stronger in the like managerial leadership, soft skills side of things. But that's where I want to specialize. Like I want to move up in that space. And the CISSP, even though it is a cybersecurity certification that can get quite technical, it is true to its nature, a risk management certification that really does equip you to think like a leader. Like it's a kind of certification that puts you into the mindset of a CISO. And I think that was super useful to learn. So for me, it was about picking that certification that will propel my career forward. But then I also did a lot of research into which certifications are highly demanded on job descriptions. And I also spent quite a lot of time in Reddit forums as well. There's quite a few that are dedicated to cybersecurity certifications. I was just kind of like tallying up, like, okay, which certifications are the most in demand, which make the most sense, which are most widely recognized, because you want to gain the most value from them.
Absolutely.
And that's how I picked the CISSP. Now, in terms of how I went about studying for it, I gave myself, it was mostly self-study with 1 week in a boot camp. The boot camp was fortunately paid for by my employer, and I recognize they're quite expensive. I wouldn't want anyone to think that they are necessary. Like you can do the whole thing self-study. It might take you like a couple of extra weeks. Between September to December last year, I studied for approximately between 15 to 20 hours a week. And this would normally be 1 hour before work, 2 hours after work during the week, and then 5 hours on a Saturday, and then I'll take Sunday off. I think it's really important to give yourself breaks because it's a marathon. It's definitely not a sprint. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was saying that, the aspect of breaks and how you time those breaks as well. The pandemic and the study cycles that some of us have gotten into can be particularly dangerous. So I really appreciate the fact that you've emphasized the break. I'll turn it back to you. You were continuing your sentence.
Yeah, I think breaks are so important because you need to ensure that you can get back to Monday and hit that week just as hard as the previous week. And it with a certification that's as broad as the CISSP, it really is a marathon. You can't sprint it. So yeah, I did a lot of self-study. Started out with like the core textbook. The first time I read it, it was a terrifying experience because I was coming across some topics I'd never read in detail about before, like cryptography and network communication and security. And the first time I read it, I was like, I'm in trouble. Like, there's no way in hell I'm going to pass this exam. And then it was during the second reread that I started to get more comfortable with it. So yeah, the core textbook, practice questions. Then I made my own cue cards. All doing things that kind of like suited how I learn personally, and I would encourage everyone to kind of think about like how you learn things, what helps you kind of stick things into your mind, and then like emphasize those strategies.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for our audience also to remember here is that one of the things that Josh brought up really well is the aspect of he went and did his homework, he did some research, saw what jobs are in demand, what we're asking for certain credentials. That's not to dissuade you from going down the strictly academic path. A lot of folks may go down, the master's path, the PhD path, which is a path that I'm pursuing. And you may not necessarily need to take a certification. It really comes down to where your interests lie and importantly, how best you can communicate this interest. This is why I've always maintained, and I go back to a tech talk that I did about a week and a half ago with Tushar Singh from Minute School, where he very eloquently said, the world has a lot of cybersecurity professionals, has a lot of developers, has a lot of coders, but we lack coders who can communicate well, cybersecurity specialists who can project manage well, cybersecurity specialists who can read well and can take in different sources of information. And that's where the identity of a Josh comes into being. So I'll also add one more thing here, Josh, and for our students that are listening, what the ultimate strength, in my opinion, is knowing your weaknesses. And you've elocuted your weaknesses very well, where you've said the technical side, which is the actual, which tool do we use? Do we take logs from Splunk? Do we use Curate? What do we use, for example? That's not necessarily where you like to play in. So I want to take that and just flesh that out a little bit more. In your career, Josh, now as a Senior Threat Intelligence Analyst, was there a little bit of friction or stigma between you or your group of folks and highly technical folks? Was there any difficulty in communicating some of your ideas, in building networks, in building working bonds? Can you talk to us a little bit about how you've gone about building relations in the workplace, which clearly have allowed you to move into different roles and now pretty much on your path to executive leadership? Josh?
Absolutely. It's a really interesting question because in any cybersecurity department, you'll have a ton of people who are highly technical and just absolutely brilliant in their space. And I think it's definitely about recognizing that this isn't competition in a negative sense. Like these are sources of knowledge and information. These are people that you can learn from. They can teach you so much. And I think it's important to respect the fact that yes, technical skills are definitely important. You can learn a lot from technical people, but that doesn't necessarily devalue like other skills or like what we've often called like soft skills and communication skills. Often soft skills are actually like, they can be the harder ones to learn because it's very difficult to teach someone how to communicate effectively with different audiences in contrast to putting someone into a technical course. I'm not trying to like, I'm not trying to diminish how difficult it is to learn technical skills, but often when I spoke to people who are more experienced in the field, they say that they will hire people focusing more on their soft skills because they tend to be the harder ones to teach.
Yeah.
So drawing on those conversations and that experience, I realized that there is a lot of value in being a very strong in the communication space, very strong in the relationship building space, and it's super important when it comes to things like communication. Every cybersecurity department exists to protect something, and that tends to be a business. And your business tends to be run by executives, and executives won't understand the highly technical content of a cybersecurity department. You need translators. You need people who can engage executives and lines of business and distill the highly technical into something that they understand, to talk about risks and cost as opposed to different encryption keys, just to really bridge that gap between cybersecurity and business. So I think a lot of technical people I work with, they recognize that that's a very useful skill set, and it kind of creates this natural collaboration whereby you have the highly technical people, those who know enough to be technical, and to collaborate with the technical folks, but then can also communicate that out to the non-technical folks. Have these kind of like translators. I think every cybersecurity department needs these people, and those translators need the technical people just as much.
Absolutely. And I think if we take that a step further for the audience that's paying attention, we'll go into this question as well, is when you start to realize that, the cybersecurity is a large community, and within that you have a lot of sub communities. The threat intel community itself is a community in and of itself. If you go back to Cyber Exchange 3.0, if you go back to some of the other conferences that you may have attended, you'll notice a lot of the threat intelligence folks. I remember doing some work with a session with Recorded Futures, for example, and you'll notice that some of their folks, the individual that was leading the threat intel, very limited background from a technical standpoint, but very sound from a standpoint of how do you look at data and how do you parse out that data. You will often find folks with data analysis background, business backgrounds, etc., going into threat intel because of that ability to take data together, make sense out of it, make meaning out of it. So again, Josh, I really appreciate the way in which you structured that. Now that I've opened up the door to the discussion on the threat intel community, I know our audience, some technical folks, some some experts, some intermediary, are quite familiar because we've done other sessions with Kaspersky, for example, on threat intelligence. Can you help us understand a little bit about what is a day in the life of a threat intelligence individual look like? When you come to your desk, is it look at all of this and tell me where there's a threat, or is there a bit of a process? Can you give us a sneak peek into what that journey is like?
It's a very difficult question to answer. Because every single day is different, and that's one of the great things about the job. Like you can map out your entire week on Sunday, and you can have like all of your project work nicely assigned in your calendar, and then it hits Monday and something just goes bang, and then you have to like drop all of your work, rearrange your week, prioritize this threat, because whilst I'm on the strategic threat side of things, and deal more with that like process and programmatic type work, I will still provide intel support for incident response items, especially if there's several coming at once and we need to kind of spread it out across the operational team and the strategic team. So yeah, I would say that the average day, it involves starting up, reviewing the different information sources, normally abiding by a process. You kind of like cut through a lot of different like sources of information efficiently, cut through the noise, find some useful pieces of information, put any like relevant pieces of information through the intel cycle. So just looking like processing it and analyzing it to see if it's relevant to your organization, and then kind of like supplying that information onto other teams. So yeah, there'll be that review of like multiple different information sources, just to kind of like ensure that you're keeping your pulse on the threat landscape. And then once that's done, once all the like information check-ins done, move on to the more like project and programmatic work. And this can be a wide variety of like workflows. So different threat categories will have different types of processes and programs set up around them, so that you can gather information on that particular threat, and are executing it in a process that is very repeatable, so you can like feed that intelligence to other operational teams to then action on it. So yeah, it's like a very interesting kind of mix between like planned, strategic, program type work, and then the more like unpredictable side of things when incidents occur, and then just this like constant like intake and analysis of information. And often like underpinning all of this will be like established processes. You need to make sure that whatever you're doing is repeatable.
Absolutely. I want to work with that repeatable aspect as well, because that's the practice element, and that's how you are prepared for those anomalies, etc. There's a little bit of a mindset that the threat intelligence specialist has to take in. One is, if there's nothing anomalous, if there's nothing that triggers your attention, you've got to still keep your processes going. How do you pivot when you start to notice either you're seeing some logs, or either you're getting some queries that may be suspicious, or you're getting some information from the wider community that something may be transpiring? How do you pivot into action mode? How do you pivot into, we're noticing something, we need to communicate that certain ports need to be switched off? Can you help us understand, how do you make those switch in gears? It's almost, I know you mentioned in the green room that you do not watch cricket. Please do not watch cricket right now. Your team England is destroying India right now. But if you do watch cricket, if you do watch cricket when India is winning, which is very important, and they will win the World Cup in November, so hold your hats for that, hold onto your seats for that. But like in cricket, we have the saying, right, that sometimes you're buying some time, but then at a certain point, you start to up the run rate because there's some urgency. How do you manage that urgency for action in your environment, Josh?
So the first thing that you'll typically do when you come across like these very initial rumors of something happening, like often this there'll be like a trickle of information down the grapevine through an information sharing group, and someone says, hey, like, look out for this. The first thing that you always do is kind of switch on your investigator's hat. Yeah. And you seek to validate that information as quickly as possible. So you try to cross-reference it with other information, and do like a deep dive to find out if this is actually something we need to worry about, or if this is something that we can ignore because it's irrelevant to us. Like, let's say that there's a huge vulnerability on like a key piece of technology that sits in supply chains. First thing that you would do as a threat intel analyst is find out if that vulnerability is like actually a thing, if it is just a rumor, or if it is an established kind of like bug to worry about. And then you would do whatever you can to understand like what that technology is, and if you have it in our environment, because that kind of tells you if it's relevant or not, and if you need to continue to action it. Yeah. And once you've kind of like validated that a threat is legitimate, it's very important to kind of like assess what is the potential impact of that. And different teams do this in different ways. You can take a qualitative assessment where you kind of like rely on an analyst's experience and judgment to say, this is a problem, we should definitely like prioritize creating some kind of like intelligence product about it. Or you can take a quantitative approach. And I've come across teams that have like threat assessment matrices or matrix. Some have like multiple matrices, others have just like one solid matrix. And you can assess that threat for likelihood to occur, or its like potential impact on your organization. And once you kind of establish that there's a threat out there and it's real and it's relevant to your organization, then it all becomes about packaging that information in a way that is like, well, first of all, analyzing it to turn it into intelligence. You package that information into an intelligence product, which can be an email-based report, it can be a full intelligence brief, it can be like a longer form intel report. And the way that you would then action it is do whatever you can do as a threat intelligence team. Like you'll have like your own kind of like workflows within your team's mandate, but often intelligence teams are quite supportive in function. Your informational teams that feed intelligence to other operational teams for them to execute. So this is where it's so important to be collaborative and have good relationships with other teams in different departments, because you will rely upon them to like execute a lot of the action items associated with the threat. So you can like send that information to a SOC and have them action it in like X, Y, Z way.
Absolutely.
that's really where like the action comes from. It comes from getting the intelligence to the right people as quickly as possible, especially if those action items extend beyond your own team.
Fantastic. And I think if you take that just a little bit of a step further, there's a question that was again WhatsApp to me, which I want to work with a little bit on, and that is with regards to the size of a threat intel team now. And perhaps, I stand to be corrected on this, but one of the lessons that I'm getting from what Josh is saying is the focus is really prevention is far better than cure. You need to know if something's coming, and forewarned is forearmed. But you'll often see that the existence of a threat intelligence individual or a specialist or a senior threat intelligence individual will be in an organization that has some amount of funds to do that kind of work, or that is in a large enterprise. But I do think this question holds relevance, Josh, is how many folks within the threat intel team do you typically find? Is there a bit of a hierarchy in terms of, I know you have senior behind your title, or there's some junior analysts, etc. How does that communication circle play out before, as you mentioned, that intelligence product, be it an email, be it a quick call, a team brief, I don't know, whatever, a Slack message, before that intelligence product is pushed, what happens internally in the hierarchy of the threat intel team?
Absolutely. So it all kind of depends on the size of your organization, because often cyber security professionals and threat intelligence professionals can be quite expensive. So you'll find that larger companies tend to have larger teams, and you'll also find that there are certain organizations that don't invest in a cyber threat intel team, for instance, because they just aren't attacked as often as other teams. But in the financial sector, because there is this perception that banks are just walking money, cyber threat actors are constantly attacking them. So you need to invest a lot in the cyber defenses and the threat intel teams. So they tend to have larger teams, and the size of the teams varies. Like I've come across some large companies that will have like 3 or 4 people, or they will have like 2 people embedded in their security operations center. And then I've come across some financial institutions in Canada that will have, between like 8 to 12, 15 people. Then in the US, they get a lot larger. Like we're talking like dozens and dozens of people in the larger banks. And in the kind of like hierarchy of things, I'd say the investment in like CTI and the size of CTI teams tend to be like smallest in Canada, and then like slightly larger in the UK, larger still in the US. So yeah, I hope it gives you an indication of the kind of size of the team. In terms of like team composition, that does vary organization to organization, but typically you'll have your junior level analysts who tend to do most of the work. Your senior level analysts like me who kind of slack off and take credit for all of the junior analysts' work.
Right.
And then of course I do my own work. And then because cyber threat intelligence teams, for instance, are kind of you have like different specializations beneath them. So you'll have like those who specialize more in tactical intelligence, which is more technical stuff. Those who specialize more in like operational intelligence, and then those who specialize in the strategic intelligence. You could have like 3 different specializations on one CTI team, cyber threat intelligence team. So you'll need managers who can like oversee those different streams. Yeah. So you'll typically have like at least 1 level of management before you hit that director level, and then up from there, I anticipate some organizations will also have a senior director who oversees like the intel function, maybe like another function in a cybersecurity department, and then you kind of like roll up into the like VP executive level up there. So it definitely does vary. Every organization does its own levels, but I hope that gives an indication of the kind of levels you have and the progression you can have in a threat intelligence team.
Absolutely. And I think for our audience that's paying attention to this, the other thing that I would add in terms of how the teams are made up is it does vary also depending on what sector that threat intelligence team is deployed within. And I know later on in this conversation, we've got about 23 odd minutes left. We'll go into a little bit about the finance side of things and threat intel within the finance sector. But I will say this, that the threat intelligence team makeup within a finance sector versus the education sector versus the medical, the healthcare sector will all vary. And there are certain skill sets that they look for. So, plan yourself accordingly if this is the field that you're looking to get into, because each sector has a little bit of a different flavor, and there's no one size fits all solution when it comes to how do you build the ideal threat intel team. Josh, working with this just a little bit more, you've mentioned, threat intelligence packages or intelligence products. As experts in this field, working in this field of threat intelligence, you also have to make decisions on what products to utilize. The tools that are out there do a lot of powerful things. It's up to you how you want to use those tools let's try to be as vendor agnostic as possible. How do you make decisions on which feeds to buy, and how do you make decisions on which feeds are better than the others? Do you look at attribution? Do you look at the types of logs? How do you make those decisions in terms of A, which products are you going to utilize and equip your team with, and B, how do you even build those relationships with the wider partner community? Because let's face it, I'm pretty sure that you get a lot of sales calls, and it can be quite difficult sometimes to manage them. So Josh, your perspective.
In terms of which vendors you go to, all depends on what you're trying to do within your program. What threats are your main priorities, and how you plan on gathering intelligence on those threats. So, for instance, the healthcare sector is being constantly bombarded by ransomware attacks, and often you'll have ransomware operators that will have these leak sites, and they will often function on the dark web or deep web, somewhere in the kind of like internet underground. So you might choose then as a healthcare professional to invest in vendors who specialize in dark web intelligence, because you'll need those vendors who have access to these kind of shady parts of the internet, and who more importantly have access to forums that are closed off to the kind of like general public on dark web. They can sometimes put a paywall on different like underground forums, or they can only accept members who have a certain reputation or by the threat actors. So obviously it's very difficult to get into these places on the internet, but they can be great sources of intelligence. So ultimately it all depends. There are so many specialized vendors out there, and they all serve very different functions. So it comes down to understanding what your priority intelligence requirements are, or they're called PIRs in the sector for sure. And once you've kind of set like what you're trying to gather intelligence on, that kind of like guides the whole conversation over who you want to engage, and which vendors you then want to reach out to book like demos with and kind of like trials with. Now, in terms of like how do you choose between vendor A and B? Often that comes down to reputation, but then also what they can actually do. Because a lot of vendors will promise you the moon and the stars, but when you actually like get into using their product, you realize that that they fall short in certain ways. Whereas you also get vendors who are fantastic, who almost undersell themselves because they've just focused so much on their product, and they haven't invested as much in marketing and the sales team. So it definitely is important to talk to people in your network, other cybersecurity professionals, to ask, to draw on like other people's experience with using different vendors to find out which ones are genuinely the most effective.
Yeah. And I think one of the other aspects I would add to this is you need to develop your own use cases. You need to develop your own sandboxes to test things out. And this is where, and I know Josh, and I use the word a lot, vendor. This is why I always look at the term partner community instead, because I look at a couple of things. How do these potential products play with other products in the market? What are some of the community testimonials that you can get? But more importantly, how much of this can you utilize in a sandbox environment and see the results? In a sandbox environment that you maintain, that you curate, which is an other skill in and of itself, to replicate your environments, to imagine the kind of threats that come your way. And this is where having a political conscience, having a knowledge of psychology, having a knowledge of other fields all factor into how do you build that simulation? How do you build that range for yourself to test products? And that's why the field of threat intelligence is extremely fascinating. Now, we've got a few more questions that have come in, and I actually want to go back. So we've got about 4 questions. And I also want to go back to a session that I did with Kaspersky. I do a show with them called In the Node. So a shout out to the team at Kaspersky. And one of the things that we did, the first session that I did was on Strength in Numbers, Threat Intelligence and Attribution.
Mhm.
And we were looking at a lot of threat intelligence experts, such as yourself, who had come together to create groups, that not-for-profit groups or pro bono groups, that would share intelligence, let's say with the healthcare sector, that would share intelligence just because they're seeing it. They would share it with other sectors as well to keep those sectors protected. Is that something that you've also found yourself getting into, where folks in the finance sector, threat intel folks, come together and have a little group where they share things? How do you build community around your work?
Absolutely. And this is a brilliant question. So one of the great things about the security sector and working in a security department, whether that's a corporate security department or a cyber security department, is you have this unique kind of privilege to collaborate with your competitors, which is unheard of with like major banks, other departments. Like you wouldn't have two capital markets departments from two major
Yeah.
banks going for lunches and sharing like hot leads. Like that would never ever happen. But in security, you have this opportunity, and it's great, and it really suits me because it enables you to build up your relationships with other people outside of your organization and to expand your network exponentially. And
Absolutely.
what governs all of this is the fact that most organizations in Canada are facing very similar threat landscapes. The same malicious actors that attack Bank One will then often try Bank Two, Bank Three, and Bank Four. And beyond that, banks also recognize that other large organizations, such as the telecom community, will face very similar threats as well, because a threat actor will breach one in order to breach another. So because there's this common enemy, it makes uniting against them so much easier. And that's one thing that I do love about security.
Yeah. And I think to add on to that is that the kind of community that has been built in security. And as you said, two competitive banks, for example, may suddenly have a middle ground where the security teams come together, etc. It
Mhm.
creates for an opportunity to share. But more than anything, for those of you who are looking at your career paths and your progression, it also gets you to see how other firms operate. It also gets you to see how other groups are. It gets you exposed to other leaders as well, other leadership styles. And believe it or not, I go back to what I and Josh, I don't know if you remember this, but about probably a month and a half ago, I did a power hour with Luke Wah. He's the CIO at Laurentian University. And he said, when it comes to, when you think about everything, digital transformation, you think about security and the new threats and blah, blah, blah. It's like, yes, budget's important. Yes, talent, etc. is important. But he mentioned that the biggest challenge that he faces is culture. And that is the approach that you
Interesting.
take, the team, how you lead your teams, how you process things, how you react when, yes, you have been breached, and it is going to happen, and how do you
Mhm.
respond to that? What do you do, etc.? And by working in this field, I will say, and I'm learning from Josh, is you get to see how different teams operate. You get to see what
Mhm.
works. You get to see the other side of things, which is truly, truly fascinating. Speaking about the banking sector, and which is where you've really built all of your strengths when it comes from a threat intelligence perspective,
Mhm.
is why specifically the finance sector? Did you just happen to fall into it? Was it an area of interest for you? What brought you into the financial world?
That is a great question. What really brought me into it was stumbling into a co-op position as a threat intelligence analyst, and that providing this kind of window into this whole world that I didn't really realize existed. So I was starting my career, and I was really interested in security and conflict and intelligence, but I didn't want to work for the government intel services. So when I was talking to one of my professors, he said, "Well, have you ever considered doing threat intelligence in the private sector?" And I was like, "Is that a thing?" And through their network, I landed this co-op position, and after that, I was hooked. Like
Yeah.
it was such a fascinating world for me to realize that like all these major companies, household names, they all have intelligence teams. They and they vary in size, but all of them invest in intelligence in some regard. And it was just brilliant because it offered you the ability to dive into an intelligence career, whilst retaining quite a lot of control over like your career and where you work and where you live, which was something that really appealed to me as well. I also I also knew that I was very keen to stay in Toronto, and in this city, I would say some of like the most prolific employers of threat intel analysts are in the financial sector. So it all kind of made sense. And then just when I entered that world, I realized that financial institutions will really invest in their people, and they will train them up. And they took a chance on me. I was like hired straight from university. I was like a very fresh graduate, and they trained me up. And it's that kind of that investment in training that I will always be grateful for in terms of the financial sector.
Absolutely. And I think, you can take this a step further is when you think about, and Josh brought this up earlier on as well, is, the banks, the financial sector ultimately tends to be the heartbeat of almost every citizen in the community. That's where your payments are processed. It tends to be where, whatever money you have, or in my case, whatever money you don't have tends to sit there somewhere in the banks, but the banks hold a very central role in the future of, and basically in the livelihood of society. So as more people come into the country, as more reliance are on banking accounts, etc., the more need, the more dependency for more creative minds, the more dependency for more creative thinkers. This is one of the reasons, and without naming any institutions directly, you'll notice that a lot of the financial institutions tend to have these innovation factories, or these little playgrounds where you can play around with different technologies and you can try them out and try different ideas. This is why a lot of the financial institutions have relationships with academic bodies, for that matter. And it's really, really fascinating when you get to do some of that applied research work as well, to see what is the art of the possible and what could be coming next, making the financial sector and security a very, very interesting space. Don't get it wrong, though, for those of you who are listening, the implications of getting it wrong as a cybersecurity specialist in the financial world can be very, very severe. And Josh, I'd like, could you comment a little bit about a little bit of that stress that plays into the role as well? Because if you keep missing things, I hope we don't have any people from the weather industry watching, but the weatherman tends to always tell us that a storm's coming, but it never does. That's okay, but you can't quite do that in the security space, Josh.
I have trust issues because of my weather app on my phone. Like, it has
you and I both
lied to me so many times. I've like planned a picnic, been outside like in shorts, then it's just thunderstorms.
Best job in the world.
Yeah. Multiple times. Imagine if surgeons had the same error rate.
Yep.
Yeah, no, you're right. Like, it can be a high pressure, high stress career path, because if you get something wrong, like in a bank, no one's going to die. You aren't a surgeon, but you could cause a serious amount of like financial and reputational damage to your organization.
Absolutely.
And the great but terrible things about reputations is they can take a lifetime to build, but like one mistake and you've crashed it. So that's why I think it's so important with your team to have like layers of checks and balances, verifications, and review, so that one individual's mistake will be caught, or like there'll be several opportunities to catch that mistake. Because it's not fair to put a co-op or a junior analyst in a position whereby if they make a mistake, that mistake will be kind of like finalized and will cause a huge impact. Yeah. Like, there was recently a breach, and the C-suite of that company came out and blamed it on a co-op or an intern. And I was thinking, like, that's not fair, because they should have like at least 2 or 3 levels of checks above them to ensure that their mistakes don't have huge impact. Yeah. Because as humans, like, we're gonna make mistakes all the time. I make mistakes all the time, but the good thing is that we have processes in place to catch those mistakes, and all that pressure isn't just on one other person. It's on at least like 2 or 3 other people. And the more important your work as a junior analyst, the more layers of checks you should have, because it's not fair to put all that pressure on someone who's still learning the job. But yes, mistakes will happen. They happen to me all the time. I've blundered multiple times. My advice to anyone who does it is own it. Like, it is the worst thing you can do with a mistake is try and cover it up, because eventually it will be found. Like, there's traces of everything you do in your organization. So if you make a mistake, own it. Just be honest, be forthright, be transparent. Talk to your manager right away and just tell them like everything. Don't try and hide stuff. It's pointless. They'll catch you. And if you try and cover up a mistake, it's far more fireable than if you made an honest mistake.
Absolutely. And I think these are extremely important tips, especially for those of you who are going into this space, whether you're going into threat intelligence or not, if you're just going even into working into the SOC environment, working as in DevOps or DevSecOps, if you made a mistake, owning it. But I think what's also more important is to understand that whichever organization you join is know what resources are available to you. And it goes back to what Josh spoke about and what I further elaborated on. It is one of the greatest strengths is knowing your weaknesses, and you need to be clear with yourself about that. Know what you do not know where you could be making a mistake, and ask. And if you're not getting the support, there are quite a lot of cybersecurity opportunities that are out there. And if an organization isn't providing that support, that is a signal for you that you need to be thinking about what is next. And I think for cybersecurity professionals, knowing not just that the jobs are available, but also knowing what organizations are going to be performing those jobs in is extremely, extremely important. Josh, we've got 3 minutes and 2 questions that have been direct messaged to me. Seems like we've got a bit of a shy crowd, but we have an interactive crowd that direct messaged me their questions, which is totally fine. One of them has to do with the role of automation. Now, we speak a lot about this in terms of AI and automatically detecting threats, and we've got a whole bunch of products and tools that can do that for you. Has AI truly augmented your analysis, or does it get you to think that it may render a couple of human roles mundane? Josh?
No industry is immune to automation, and that includes the cybersecurity sector. Always be vigilant for what kind of roles can be automated out by machine learning and artificial intelligence, because it's going to happen. It's inevitable. But try and identify those roles that require a human mind to analyze something. Because you can automate many parts of the intelligence cycle, like such as the information collection and processing. But in terms of the analysis stage, that's very difficult to automate away, because you need a human who understands the complexities of your organization to really tease out the relevance of this piece of intelligence, and to identify the so what factor. Like, so what if we have a financially motivated state-sponsored group attacking your financial organization? Like, why is that important? And like, are your controls significant enough to stand up against it? What do your executives need to know? Like, these are kind of right now questions that machine learning and artificial intelligence and automation can't quite grasp. So there will be certain processes automated out, yes, but all this means is that you need to keep your sights on those analyst roles that really can't be automated out, at least not anytime soon.
Absolutely. And I will go a step further, and I'll say this is that no, and as Josh had mentioned, no role is immune from automation and AI, so on and so forth. There are some specialist skills that are required to understand these tools, but also understand that a lot of these AI and automated driven tools rely a lot on data. They rely a lot on what you provide into these tools. So there's still that element of human intelligence that is required. Also, I do a lot of work with different consulting groups. Like, a lot of them have AI readiness indexes. There are some things that you can automate and action. There are some things that you can automate but leave for human validation. This is actually creating for a more complex territory of decision making, and is increasing the amount of decisions that need to be made because you are digesting more data than the human mind could. I also take the position, Josh, that software inherently that is programmatic in the traditional classical sense is no longer kind of where we're headed to. Almost every tool out there will produce some form of automation and will work with the data. So it's an inevitable reality that software is taking an intelligent route, and it's going to happen. And you just have to understand how to use some of these tools to best effect. So I do think that having an AI background is good. And with that, we'll go to the last question and give Josh about 30 seconds to respond to this. Josh, how do you deal with anonymous tips and anonymous information that comes your way? Is attribution super important to you, or do you act on anonymous information as well?
Attribution isn't that important. It doesn't matter if you correctly identify that an attack was a particular government, because you can't really do anything about it. So attribution matters less. Anonymous tips, we do act on those. We tend to investigate them take them seriously and always look to validate them. We will never act solely on an anonymous tip, because when you don't know the source, you can't validate its reliability. Yeah. So we always look to like validate and corroborate an anonymous tip. And one thing I quickly want to say about public speaking, I think, Ali, you've done such a great investment by investing in your public speaking, because I came across this expression that you can't automate public speaking.
Yeah.
So I think you'll be forever employed.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you. And although I could continue talking about myself, I shall not. But I want to take 20 seconds and just come to this little question that comes from nobody except from me. And that is, if not threat intelligence, if not the senior threat intelligence individual that you are, where do you think you would have landed in your career?
Oh, good question. Probably a think tank. I'm fascinated by analysis and geopolitics. So working for a think tank kind of would have made sense for me, especially in terms of my academic background.
Yeah.
So yeah, a think tank, and then later on in my career, it's still a big aspiration of mine to go and work for a humanitarian organization like Doctors Without Borders. Like I think they do fantastic work, and my aim is to work for them at some point in another life. Maybe I would have started my career with them. Who knows?
Absolutely. If there's anybody from the elections that's running a campaign looking for a hardcore analyst, hey, Josh, although he may not be looking, up to you to poach him if you can. With that, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else that's tuned in, I want to thank all of you for your time today. Over the next couple of weeks, you'll be seeing a new release of Power Hour session and some new other exciting sessions. But I really hope that this session, since we had a lot of requests for it, allowed you to get to see inside what a threat intelligence analyst goes through and what their journey is like. I think with Josh, one of the things that I learned is, aim for the moon. And if you miss, you land on some stars. Try, aim, his approach with the CISSP, not easy. And I can tell you this because without a technical background, opening up some of those chapters on cryptography, for example, and then understanding that there's a world of digital currencies and ecosystems around that he needs to get familiar with in the finance world is not easy, but nothing is. And anything that's worthwhile doesn't come easy. So with that, you'll be seeing more information about the next Power Hours coming up shortly. Josh, I'm going to ask you to stay on for a couple of more seconds. And to our audience, if you haven't yet registered, CISO Forum's coming up in November. It's a hybrid event, so please feel free to buy your tickets accordingly. Next week, you'll be seeing some more sessions on the Power Hour, Tech Talk DC, and some more sessions with Julia Lee, Helen Oakley, and a couple of other interesting folks from the Cyber Exchange community. Things are not looking too good when it comes to the pandemic. We are looking at that. We are into a fourth wave. So I ask all of you to stay safe, stay healthy wherever you are. There is light at the end of this tunnel, and we will get there eventually. Have a happy Friday, and I'll see you at the very next Power Hour. Cheers.